Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Peter DeWitt. Peter is an author, a keynote speaker, and a workshop facilitator. He is a school leadership expert whose work has been adopted at both the state level and at the university level. He also works with numerous school districts, school boards, regional networks, ministries of education, not just in North America, but quite literally around the world. Peter also writes the Finding Common Ground column for Education Week. He has co-created the Education Week's A Seat at the Table, where he moderates conversations with experts around a variety of topics. He is the author of 8 books. You kind of get the picture here. Peter is an educational force. Today, our focus is going to be on one of those books, Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice Out of Theory. We're going to focus on that book and about instructional leadership. If you're an educational leader or an aspiring leader, I would be shocked if you haven't heard of Peter DeWitt or become intimately familiar with his work. But if you haven't, that is about to change. So Peter, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Tom, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Peter. It's great to have you here. I'm a big fan of your work and an admirer, not just of your work, but how you go about the work. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And we're going to focus on the role of the principal. We're going to sort of zero in on the role of the leader in the school. And so let's jump right into it. Start with the overarching big idea. You state that in your research, you have found that many principals believe that they are instructional leaders. They see themselves as instructional leaders, but a lot of teachers don't share that view. That's sort of been your finding. So I'm wondering if that's because principals don't really understand what it means to be an instructional leader. Does that mean teachers don't really understand what instructional leadership is? Is it a little bit of both? So what is instructional leadership, and why do you think that gap exists between the teachers and administrators' perceptions?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that I've been looking at for a while because based on questions that I get asked when I'm running workshops. And, I first wrote about instructional leadership in a book called Collaborative Leadership: 6 Influences That Matter Most. It was based on John Hattie's research, and instructional leadership was one of those influences. So over the years, I've really taken a look at it, and I've done research. I've read, instructional leadership has been one of the most researched forms of school leadership over the past 50 years. Edmonds looked at it back in the 1970s. And one of the things that makes it so complicated is that, yes, it's all of what you said. It's that school building leaders don't necessarily know what constitutes instructional leadership, or they feel like they're jumping into instructional leadership practices, but maybe those practices are flawed, like learning walks. I've always had a love-hate relationship with learning walks and walkthroughs because I feel like they're done to teachers, not done with them. I think part of what complicates it is the relationship that administrators, and notice how I say administrators, not leaders, administrators have had with teachers, where I've honestly worked with teachers and leaders where the teachers have said, like, leaders aren't supposed to come into our classrooms. Administrators aren't supposed to come into our classrooms unless they're asked to come in. And that was just not the philosophy I had when I was a school principal. Yeah. And the discrepancy piece always takes place, whether you're doing surveys of students and teachers on the same topic or teachers and principals on the same topic. You're always going to have a discrepancy between what leaders might believe, what teachers might believe, and all of that. And one of the things that I found is that school leaders really felt very confident when it came to instructional leadership. But when I surveyed teachers didn't feel so confident. And there were a lot of reasons why that might happen. But one that I talk about in workshops and webinars and whatever is the idea of proximity. Like if I have a good relationship with you and maybe you teach a subject that I used to teach, and I go into your classroom quite a bit because we have a good relationship. I feel very comfortable. I feel confident to be able to walk in and see what you're teaching because I had taught the same content. But say, somebody down the hall from you teaches with their door closed and they teach content that I didn't teach and I don't feel as confident. And I'm more likely to bypass their classroom because they keep the door closed. Well, if the two of you fill out the same survey asking whether Peter, whether you feel very confident that Peter's an instructional leader, you, Tom, are probably going to say, yeah, I'm very confident. I see Peter all the time. We talk about learning, whatever. But that teacher down the hallway might not feel the same way because they might say, Peter, I've never seen him, like he's never in my classroom. So that's why I always go back to, and I never want to like reinvent the wheel. I really want to look at what structures do we have in place. because everybody talks about how time is a factor and how stress is a factor and all that stuff. So let's look at the structures you already have in place. And that's where faculty meetings are probably one of the places where we have the greatest proximity to all of our staff. And when I was a school principal, I used to flip my faculty meetings. We would focus on learning. I would find an article or a blog a few days ahead of time, and then we would get together to talk about it and all that stuff and develop a common language, common understanding. I think that all of those are that point of clarity about instructional leadership is what's not present. And I think that it's even more complicated because principals feel the pressure to be instructional leaders, because even though it's been around for 50 years, there's been a major push over the past 20. But at the same time, I don't know if they always have a deep understanding of what that's supposed to look like or how often it's supposed to take place within their schools. And it also means that they have to develop relationships with their teachers, where teachers actually not only want them in the classroom, but actually value the dialogue that they engage in together around the learning that's taking place in that classroom.
Right. You can see that if we all have a different working definition of what instructional leadership means, then that gap may just be a perception or an understanding about what are we talking about here, for sure. I think all of us, well, I should say all of us, but I know that when I first moved into administration, I had this idea of wanting to be an instructional leader. My master's degree was in curriculum and instruction. It wasn't in educational administration. I really wanted to be that instructional leader. I think a lot of us have that desire, but the lack of clarity around what it actually means to be that instructional leader, which is why you're here, Peter, which is why we're going to explore this topic as we go further.
I can give you a really great example. I was working with a very strong group of school administrators in a school district in Massachusetts. And I've worked with them before. They're very vocal. And I love that about them. Like, I love knowing I'm with a group that if they don't agree with me, they're going to let me know. I love the engagement that way. But so we had gone through and I had them fill out. It was one of the online engagement tools that we use when we're running a presentation. And one of the questions was, I feel confident I'm an instructional leader. And there was, very confident, somewhat confident, not confident at all. 100% of them said they felt very confident. So when we got to a place where we talked about a focus for learning within classrooms, and I talk a lot about Bloom's Revised Taxonomy by Anderson, where we talk about conceptual, procedural, factual, and metacognitive. One of the things that came out is that they rank them in order. They see factual way the most. They see procedural second, conceptual is third, but they see less of it. And then metacognitive, they see very little. And I even talk about, maybe it's not that it's not going on in the classroom, it's just that you don't know to look for it. But when I said, so why is it you see factual all the time? And it was high school. Why do you see factual all the time in the classroom? And I was kind of amazed, because some of the school leaders were like, teachers find it easier. They like their worksheets. And they were yelling out those things. And I remember it dawned on me, because I looked at them and I said, just this morning you filled out that you felt very confident that you were instructional leaders. If you're such a great instructional leader, why do you still see this happening in the classroom? And why is it that you're not addressing those very behaviors that you just talked about with me? Why are you not addressing those with your faculty? And like, you can see, I honestly thought I was going to get kicked out. Like, I thought they were going to throw something at me, because they are the group to do that. But you can see it just like went dead silent. And I'm just sitting there going, oh God, why didn't I think before I spoke? And they agreed. They were like, you're absolutely right. And it was just for me, it was one of those profound moments. And you've had these two running workshops. It was a profound moment where we all had an aha moment at the same time. And I think that speaks to the complications around instructional leadership. You can feel very confident, and yet when you ask a simple question about what's going on in the classroom, you don't feel like you have any impact on that whatsoever. And that's just strange to me. It's supposed to go hand in hand.
Yeah, I love those breakthrough moments. They are moments where you're like, should I have said that? And there's a little bit of awkward silence, and everybody kind of goes, yeah, actually, you're kind of right. And I
How
mean,
far
every
away
once
is
in
the
a while,
airport?
every once in a while it goes sideways, but not as often as one might anticipate. That's for sure. Listeners, honestly, I cannot speak highly enough about this book. There are so many great features in the book. One thing that caught my attention right away in the model was you made a conscious decision to write a separate chapter about implementation. And a lot of books would follow the formula where here's the idea, and now here's a section at the end about here's how you go about it. Here's the implementation side. But you decided, rather than focus on implementation within each chapter, you wrote an entire chapter on implementation itself. So my question is why? Why did you separate implementation? What led to that decision? And why do you think paying attention to implementation is so critical that it deserved its own chapter?
Yeah, I would love to tell you it was my idea, but it wasn't. I was actually going to follow suit and just put implementation as part of the other pieces. And I have one of the pieces that worried me too is that I wrote collaborative leadership, 6 influences that matter most. And then all of a sudden with instructional leadership, I find myself with 6 pieces. And like, no, I can't have instructional leadership, 6 more pieces,
That's right.
like, but so I really wanted that 5, but so I have a couple of very good friends and, confidants or whatever you want to call them, but Stephen Cox runs an organization called Osiris in the UK, and I do a lot of work with them. And then John Hattie, who most people would know as far as a researcher. John's been a mentor and very good friend of mine for over like 7 years. And when I was talking about the premise of the book with them, Stephen had suggested, and I think I wrote about this in the book, Stephen had suggested that I take out and separate an implementation and just make it its own chapter. And John agreed. And that's where John sort of introduced me, or I should say reintroduced me to the program logic model. Program logic models have been around for a very long time, but they can be very complicated. And I wanted to create one that was simple that John ended up using. So that was a good sign. But it was really because of Stephen and John that I separated it out. And it really was it was good feedback on their part, because I was glad that I did it, because we all know Michael Fullen's work on implementation dips and all those kind of things. And in the middle of writing this book, just like I think people need to understand that while we are writing a book, it's not that we have this great office, that we're working from and we're working in solitude and all that stuff. You and I are mostly like writing on planes and writing in hotel rooms. And
that's right.
And that's the cool part, is that the people we work with, the audiences, the participants we work with, really shape what we're writing. And at that same time, I happen to be working with a group in California that they had a lot of initiatives, but they were not implementing well. And so it's funny how, and I know you've experienced this too, where you're talking about an idea, you're talking with your confidants or your very close colleagues about your idea that you're writing about, and then suddenly you're in this workshop where all of these things sort of come together, and you have clarity as far as, that's what we need to be able to do. And that's why I also realized that not only did they give me good advice, but it was absolutely necessary that I talk about implementation first. And, since writing the book, I've run a lot of workshops, done a lot of coaching, a lot of strategic planning with places. And that program logic model and the whole idea of implementation first has come in very, very handy. And it has helped cement, or ground the work that people are trying to do. And that's the thing that I think people also need to understand, is that anything I write comes out of a level of respect. It's non-judgmental. And I know that sounds really easy to say, but I go in with a non-judgmental attitude. I'm going in saying, what can I learn? Where do I fit into all of this? And when I was writing about the program logic model and implementation, I really did it from a standpoint of, there are initiatives that are really, really important. And yet they fall through the cracks because we don't always take the time, or we don't find the time to give them our effort that they need. and doing a program logic model and talking about implementation, whether we're talking about in a classroom, in a school, in a district division, whatever. It's really important that we talk about that first, because I'm really tired of hearing people say building the plane while flying.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like we need to get away from that.
No, I couldn't agree more. So for listeners, Peter, without giving away the plot of the book, just can you highlight for us, what do you mean when you say program logic model? What are the big ideas that listeners need to think about?
Yeah, so a program logic model tends to be very complicated. Like, it gives you a starting point, and then you go through all these, different pieces that, and then then you get to the end result. And I really I made mine really 5 areas that we need to talk about. And this is not some like how-to manual where it's 5 easy steps and you're going to hit it. It starts off with understanding your current reality. Like, where are you that you want to grow in? Where do you want to make an improvement, right? And then the second column is where we're looking at inputs. And when I'm talking about inputs, I'm talking about different elements, resources that we need, like sharing best practices, evidence-based articles, research-based articles, models of successful practice, but also time, putting down the time factor, because we know that that's a big issue. Let's talk about the resources we need, which is the input, before we jump into the activities, and activities are next. And I use the word activities because, quite honestly, unless you're going to do them correctly, they're just activities. So learning walks and walkthroughs, faculty meetings, PLCs, those are activities. You want them to have impact, but they don't often have the impact that they need, because they're just something you do to tick off the list and not necessarily do them with depth. The next column, the 4th column, is actually called outputs. And I specifically use the wording outputs because if you're going to take those activities and do something in depth with them, then you need to have sort of a timestamp. You need to be able to say, like, I'm going to start doing this in October or November. And the reason why I did that is because we often will talk about the activities we're going to engage in, like a diet, working out, losing weight, and yet months go by and we haven't started any of it. So instead of just talking about the activities we need to do, outputs are where we also hold ourselves accountable to say when we're going to start them. And you can obviously go a lot deeper into like putting out how often and when and all that stuff. And then the last column, the 5th column, is actually impact. How did teachers and students benefit from this? And I specifically use the words benefit because I was a school principal, and I felt like, especially in New York State where I live, we had so much accountability, so many mandates. And I remember that my teachers had said, like, we feel like our voices don't matter. And I was lucky I had the blog, I was speaking out for them. So it was something we felt together. We felt like we were just like, we just didn't have a voice. And I wanted to find ways to have a voice. And so when we talk about impact, we have to talk about how are teachers and students going to benefit from this? And when I've done this, one of the first times I did a program logic model with a group, I knew that they had a lot of initiatives, but they didn't have a lot of impact, but they needed to see it. And when we went through, they named, I think they had something like 12 or 13 initiatives that they were trying to do at the same time. High poverty school district, which is what happens to high poverty school districts. People are like, well, you need this, you need that, you need this. Here's the money, you can go after it. And when we got to the impact part, the person, one of the directors that I was working with, she looked at me and she said, wow, we have a lot of activities, but we don't have impact. And I said, yeah, you're activity rich and impact poor. And I ended up writing a blog. I flew away from there and I actually wrote a blog that I posted about that situation. So it's really about getting districts and whoever's filling out the program logic model to understand that activities are really important, but impact is even more important. And that's one issue. That's one thing that can help them.
For sure. It's so true that sometimes until you see it on paper, until you actually see how many initiatives you have, or on a screen or on a chart paper or something, until you see, and then you look at the impact that some of them are not having or some of them are having, it really helps you sort out your priorities. Because I don't know anyone who's not suffering from initiative fatigue, right?
Oh,
Just
yeah,
struggling to figure out how to prioritize. And I think the model is a great way to do that.
thank you.
Another part of your model that really resonated with me was the and I know listeners, you're gonna hear this and you're gonna say, well, yeah, thanks, but it was the focus on learning. Because
Yeah.
it's easy, it's really easy for educators to be dismissive or cynical of hey, focus on learning. It's like, thanks, Peter, focus on learning. Gee, I never thought of that. We only work in schools, but I'm with you on this because there is much more to focus on when it comes to learning than meets the eye. And I think that this is something that we can be flippant about, but I think it's a really important point you make. So what does a focus on learning really mean for instructional leaders?
Yeah, I think I write from a place of curiosity. And I was doing a lot of learning walks with school principals. And when I always ask them, like, what do you look for when you go into a classroom? And not all of them, actually, most of them, didn't necessarily have a good sense of what they were looking for. I remember once there was a principal that I worked with who said they were looking for student engagement. And I said, so what does student engagement mean? And it basically meant time on task. I was like, we need to move away from that. So I started to do a lot of research around what do we look for when we go into the classroom? Because I come from the elementary world. I was an elementary school teacher for 11 years. And I worked for a principal that used to like come into our classrooms and say, oh, there's an empty spot. I need, you to put up a drawing up there and all that stuff. And I'm not saying hanging up student work wasn't important. I certainly loved hanging up student work. But it became this case of like the Pinterest classroom. Are we walking in to look at the Pinterest classroom? And that along with there's certain research that has always impacted me when I've read it. Like I've looked back, and I know you feel about this way too, where you sit there, you read it, and you're just going, oh, wow, like that is unbelievable. And for me, one of the pieces of research is Rob Coe out of the UK. And Rob Coe actually found that it's something like, and people are going to have to check me out. I'm believing I'm saying this right. Around 80% of the time students are in our classrooms, they're sitting cooperatively. But about 75% of that time that they're sitting cooperatively, they're actually doing individual work. So we're really good at cooperative seating, not necessarily cooperative learning. I've been asked really great questions. Like I've had people say, is that a problem? Like, no, because I was a first grade teacher for 7 out of 11 years. Like there were times we had center-based learning, but the kids were supposed to be working independently, but I knew they were supposed to be working independently. I didn't fool myself to say they're working cooperatively.
Right.
But if we're going to call it cooperative learning, then let's do that. And I remember as a school principal, I mean, I went into every classroom every morning, say good morning. I went back in during the day. And I remember going into some places and I would see kids working cooperatively and I'd be like, yes. And then I was lucky enough to have a doctoral mentor who would say, are you going deep enough? And I turned around and I would go back into the classroom and I would see that the kids were doing individual work. So with all of that, I started thinking, what is a focus on learning supposed to be? And the easy answer would have been depth of knowledge. Like people, I remember somebody, I was working with a group in New Jersey and somebody was very angry with me, but they wanted to know why I didn't do DOK. And honestly, I don't think I had a good answer at that time, but the reason why I didn't choose DOK and I chose Bloom's revised taxonomy instead is because I wanted something very tangible that we could start with. I felt like Bloom's revised taxonomy, Anderson's Bloom's revised of knowledge dimensions was a tangible way and it was a gateway into going into something like depths of knowledge. Because the reality is, I think there are a lot of leaders who are very confident when it comes to management, but not as confident when it comes to instructional leadership. And until they can't get to DOK if they don't understand like about factual, procedural, conceptual, and metacognitive learning. And do we actually focus on that when we're doing learning walks? Do we talk about that at our faculty meetings? We know we've got factual down because one of the worst answers I always hear, but it's the reality is it's on the test.
Yeah.
But we know procedural is something really important, especially when we're talking about math. And, when I taught kids how to read, so procedural really important. But what about the conceptual? I'm a conceptual. I feel like out of all the ways to learn, conceptual is something I am good at. And I feel like, what about the conceptual piece where we can understand where we learned here can be moved into another content area? And then the metacognitive piece. As a former struggling learner who barely graduated from high school, I didn't know how I learned. And it wasn't until I got to my third community college and went into the Learning Assistance Center when I was 21 years old that I started to learn how I best learned. And that's why I feel so strongly about metacognitive, because it's about how can we help kids understand how they themselves learn.
Right.
And that's why I think those knowledge dimensions that focus on learning is so important. And then you can do things like DOK. And the whole idea of focus on learning, there was one more addition to that. And it's remember Hattie would always say, we're really good. He wrote a brilliant paper called The Politics of Distraction. And it was the first paper he ever asked me to edit, which is a highly intimidating situation when John Hattie asks you to edit his papers.
I can imagine.
But he asked me to edit it. And I remember I was on a plane. I was actually flying to the UK to meet with him. So the pressure was on.
Yeah.
And I loved the paper. It was just something that I thought was brilliant. And what he said is that we often talk about adult issues. We don't talk enough about learning. And he was absolutely right. I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about adult issues and how we get along and all that stuff. And we don't spend enough time at faculty meetings and PLCs and all of those kind of structural places, school leadership team meetings, talking about learning. And that's what we should be doing.
Right. Is that where that discrepancy we talked about off the top, where there might be in some cases, I'm not saying this happens in every case, but is it possible that the distinction between, teachers seeing, well, you're not an instructional leader because you're not an expert in my content area, whereas we want principals, we want school leaders, we want them to focus on the principles of learning, right? We want them to focus on instruction and learning, not necessarily to be the content expert. Do you see that discrepancy as being part of the reason why that perception gap exists between teachers and principals?
Yeah, it's certainly one of the criticisms too. I remember running into somebody, I was speaking at a research conference, and afterwards somebody said, when you talk about instructional leadership, you don't talk about the fact that principals should be content experts. And I said, no, I don't. And they said, well, in our school district, we expect our principals to be content experts in every grade level that they lead. And I said, then you're setting your principals up for failure.
Oh, no
because
kidding.
with all due respect, there's just, especially at the secondary level, but even as an elementary principal, K-5, you're not going to know all the standards of all the content, and standards change. And I just feel like we have to find a happy medium. And that's where the focus for learning came from as well. There has to be a happy medium where all of this is concerned. And I think the thing that's hard is that, unless we're having these discussions at our faculty meetings to talk about what instructional leadership could look like. And in the book, I expanded the vision of instructional leadership because we're talking about building leaders, but I want to be clear that I think that teacher leaders, instructional coaches, department chairs, they need to practice instructional leadership, because very often those positions are the ones where they don't have an administration background. And now we put them in this leadership position and they don't know what to do necessarily all the time when a colleague pushes back on them, a colleague they teach next to. So instructional leadership is about not just one person either. It's about how we're all going to benefit because of the fact that a principal might not have content expertise. You need instructional leadership among your colleagues that you're working with, because somebody else might be able to step up where someone doesn't. And that other thing about the credibility factor, one of the pieces of research that really inspired a lot of that was Doug Stone and Sheila Heen from Harvard wrote a book called Thanks for the Feedback. And they talked about feedback triggers. And you always wonder why people get upset when you give them feedback. And I'm certainly not great at taking feedback all the time. So I'm one of those people too. But they talked about feedback triggers. And there's the truth trigger, which is it goes off when you find that the feedback you're getting is unhelpful or untrue. And then there's the identity trigger, which is you get upset because the feedback you're getting doesn't align with the vision you have of yourself, the identity that you set up for yourself. The third one is the relationship trigger, and the relationship trigger goes off, not that the feedback is wrong, but it's because of the fact that the person giving you the feedback, you don't feel has credibility to give you that feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So that relationship trigger and the feedback, as soon as I read that, I started thinking about learning walks, formal observations, informal observations. And if I'm a principal and I'm not seen as a credible source, then what happens to that feedback? It could fall flat and not have any impact whatsoever. So yeah, those are all the pieces, not to complicate it, and that's why I wanted to hone in on. So let's talk about what we as school principals can sort of admit that we can do. Like, what can we commit to doing when we're going into classroom? What can we commit to looking for? What can we commit to talking about? And that's where the factual, procedural, metacognitive, and conceptual come into.
The reason that focus on learning really resonated with me is because we see parallel research around assessment and feedback, in that a lot of the research, when I go around and I say to people, you got to focus on learning, they're like, thanks, Tom. But the point is that there are times where you can give feedback that improves the quality of a task, but because it's so task specific, the feedback's not transferable, and therefore you don't impact the long-term learning, right? So in our work in feedback, we're often saying, focus on the learning, give the feedback to the learning, because that's transferable. You might change the task. For example, you could have students engage in a debate. You could then have them write an argumentative paper. Those are two different ways of formulating an argument, but they are still about argument. So if my feedback is focused on improving your debate skills, that won't be transferable. Whereas if I focus on your formulating of an argument, it is. So it really resonated with me, because I think there is a lot to say about, it sounds very superficial and flippant to say focus on learning. But I think if we scratch beneath the surface, we realize we can get very distracted from learning and start to get focused on tasks and all the other things that sort of run around the periphery of what truly matters in schools. So you highlight in the book, you highlight teacher clarity, classroom discussions, and metacognition. You talked a little bit about that already as three high leverage strategies or approaches to learning. So why is it important for leaders to first be aware of how important those strategies are, and two, what do these strategies actually lead to in terms of the most desirable outcome?
So you asked really great questions, Tom.
Oh, thanks.
So
I try.
So I will say that this became even more important after the pandemic, when everything went to pandemic teaching and learning, then remote teaching and learning. Teacher clarity has been around since the 70s. Like, the 70s to me were a really cool time. And not just because I was born in 1970, but you've got Edmonds talking about instructional leadership back in the 70s. You've got Odetola's research on student engagement from 1972. And then you've got Cruikshank talking about teacher clarity in the 1970s. And the thing that I think is really important is, like, I did surveys of students during the pandemic, from last summer, and students were talking a lot about this, like how teachers were talking at them. They didn't get the opportunity to necessarily go into cooperative learning. And we know that there's research around teacher talk versus student talk as well. And so this whole idea for me was really to start looking at the fact that teacher clarity is something that's really important, and it can really be cut down to 10 minutes. And then students go into that cooperative learning piece where they're learning together, which we know is beneficial, especially for struggling learners, because they enjoy hearing the same kind of learning from their peers who are going to use it in a language they understand. But the teacher clarity piece there was just really important, because especially during remote times, when I go in to do remote learning walks, I'm looking for the teacher clarity piece, because if you've got students who are sitting on the other side of the screen and they've got who knows what's going on within their home, teacher clarity is really more important than ever, because in those moments that you have students that are online, if you're going to maximize that time, teacher clarity is that piece that's going to lead to not only deeper learning, but it's going to lead to student engagement. Because if we have teacher clarity and we do it for 25 minutes, we've lost the students. But if we can find that sweet spot and maybe, talk for 10 minutes about it, and then students engage in the learning, we know that's going to increase student engagement. We know it's going to probably lead to deeper learning. So that's why teacher clarity is so important. And I know that I got criticized early on. I think it was before the book got published, because somebody said, why are you separating knowledge, the focus on learning, student engagement, and instructional strategies? And my answer was pretty simple. Student engagement, Odetola's research shows that students are alienated because they don't feel like they have an emotional connection to their school or teacher, which we totally saw when the pandemic hit. And the second reason is they don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning, which is another thing we saw. So when we're looking at things like knowledge dimensions, through a focus for learning, and then instructional strategies, the reason why I separated them is because we need to be able to look at student engagement from a social, emotional, and an academic level. Then we need to look at instructional strategies that are actually going to engage them, instead of housing them under one big umbrella of student learning.
Look, I mean, that focus is so critical, that we become clear so that we can recognize, as leaders, we can recognize what's happening in classrooms and how we can really help engineer those opportunities for teachers to engage in that the conversation, which really does lead to a kind of efficacy, doesn't it? It leads to a collective efficacy. So talk a little bit about that in terms of how does our focus on instructional leadership and the work that we do in engineering these opportunities in schools, how does that sort of create that collective efficacy amongst the staff?
Yeah, efficacy is a topic that I think I will always write and pursue about, because I am I mean, I've seen efficacy before, but it was, once again, Hattie, I give a lot of respect to, and also a lot of thanks over the years because of his mentorship. But that whole idea of self-advocacy, the research behind it, to me was powerful, because when I was working with instructional coaches, and I still do, but early on when I was working with instructional coaches through Jim Knight, one of the things that happened is instructional coaches would say, how are you supposed to work with resistant teachers? And my thought was, maybe we need to stop looking at them as resistant, and maybe we need to start looking at the confidence level. And so self-efficacy is basically the confidence we have in our own actions. And it's also the competence behind it, but it's the confidence we have in our own actions. And what Shannon Moran and Garis's research out of the College of William and Mary showed is that it's context specific. So I might be very confident when it comes to using instructional strategies, but not confident at all when it comes to building student-teacher relationships. So one of the things that I started to look at after that is this whole idea of leadership self-efficacy, which Bandura, the godfather of efficacy, looked at in 2000. And what Bandura found is that leaders who felt confident were going to double their efforts, and when they didn't feel confident, they were going to slacken their efforts. I did my doctoral research on how well school administrators safeguard LGBTQ students. And what I found in New York State is that a lot of leaders could not get away from that as fast. They couldn't get away from it faster. And why? I think a lot of it, and some of it was just the fact that they didn't believe in it, but some of it was that they didn't feel confident to take the topic on. We can separate LGBTQ and look at race and equity and everything else. What that leads to is building collective teacher efficacy or collective efficacy. And Jenny Donahue, who is another confident and great friend, the three of us just wrote an article for Ontario, and it was on the fact that that collective efficacy is this conviction that we can work together and impact student achievement in a positive way. And that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to, when we look at our PLCs, when we get together with our team, do we have the confidence in each other that we have the conviction that we can actually have an impact on student learning? And do we go through an inquiry cycle in order to actually figure out what that current reality is, where we want to improve, and what strategies are going to work best? And one of the topics that I sort of talked about, I dropped in the book on instructional leadership, is that of collective leader efficacy. And that is a topic that I actually just finished writing. I'm going to have a book. I have a book coming out on that in the fall. And the reason why that's a little bit different is that collective teacher efficacy is how a group of teachers come together.
Right.
But when you've got collective leader efficacy, which people like Ken Leithwood out of Ontario has researched quite a bit, when you've got collective leader efficacy, what that means is that you've got a school leadership team where there's a principal and assistant principal. And if we know anything, principals and assistant principals come with a level of status.
Yeah.
And teachers don't feel as comfortable speaking up. So what we also have to look at, besides the fact that collective efficacy is that conviction, what I looked at are the preconditions, and I created preconditions that are necessary for the team to come together.
Mm-hmm.
And it all leads to what you were saying, because it's around things like communication, understanding social sensitivity, understanding well-being, understanding that we work in a school that's actually going to value our opinion. Those are the collective efficacy is really easy to talk about, but it's a lot harder to do because we really need to break that down to its finer parts and get the understanding of do people actually believe they're working in a school district that really values the innovations that they're trying to do.
Right.
And that's where collective efficacy comes in.
Right. I look, Peter, I think we could go on and on. I just really resonate with the content for sure. So let's think about it this way. There's listeners out there, leaders out there right now thinking to themselves, look, Peter, I get it. I'm in theoretically.
Yeah.
I'm ready to roll. But here's what you don't understand, Peter. I'm buried every day in all of the managerial duties that come with being a principal in my school, in my district. You just don't understand how I'm caught in the middle with the mandates from the state and from district office, trying to support all the managerial issues at the school level. So what advice do you have for leaders who have this authentic desire to become instructional leaders, but either are feeling overwhelmed right now with all the managerial duties, or they just don't know where to start, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But what advice do you have for leaders who are saying, I'd love to be an instructional leader, but I just feel completely overwhelmed right now?
Yeah. Oh, and it's very real. I mean, I coach leaders, but I was, and I talk about this in the book. I mean, as a school principal myself, I dealt with accountability. I dealt with school consolidations, budget cuts, all that stuff. And one of the things that I had to look at is, where are the places that I can practice instructional leadership? So number one, it was going, between the first bell and the second bell, I was able to go around every morning to say good morning to the kids, but that's not instructional leadership, that's building relationships. Then it was, what I found is that I had about an hour in the morning between parent phone calls and all that stuff, and between when lunches started, that I could actually go into classrooms and just commit to that. Do you have a half an hour? Do you have an hour that you can go into classrooms? No, you're not going to make it into the whole school, but maybe on, one day you can make it into one grade level or one content area or whatever. Other days, you might have that brilliant day where everything comes together, the sun is shining, and you're able to go into all the grade levels. But commit to an hour. Commit to, like, I can do this. Yeah. Commit to the fact that we can look at, okay, we have management to do, but we know at our faculty meetings, most of what we talk about could be sent in an email. Right. And I'm tired of hearing people say, well, people don't read their emails. We've had email for 25 years. It's time for people to read their email. So keep it short. But put some of these bulleted things in the email, send it out to them. Take 15 minutes to talk about management, take 45 to talk about learning. Right. School leadership team, take some time to focus on learning there. Have conversations with teachers, like the conversations you have with teachers in the hallway about learning. Send out articles that you find really interesting that you read in Educational Leadership or Education Week, or Tom's got his new book and you find it to be brilliant and you want to send out something you learned from Tom. Like it's the small stuff that can lead to the bigger things. It doesn't, I worry that sometimes people walk in, and I have specifically said this, like people will walk into a situation, they'll be like, I have to practice instructional leadership 24/7. No, you don't. No. Give yourself an hour and then start thinking about the different places that you have conversations, and think about the places where you can be proactive. In fact, one really quick one is, I know we're going to be wrapping up soon. I had 2 union reps, and they used to come to me quite often to stop me in the hallway and say, Peter, we have an issue we've got to take care of in the school. And then I would find that their idea of a big issue wasn't necessarily the big issue I was thinking it was. And I remember it was only like, it was a few months into my leadership that I just said, it seems like we have a lot to talk about. Would you be comfortable meeting with me every Friday morning from 8 to 9 o'clock because our kids didn't come in until 9:05. And they said, yeah, we can do that. The next time they stopped me in the hallway, I said, is this a crisis or is this something that can wait until Friday? Most times it could wait until Friday. And the reason why I
Right.
did that is every time I got stopped in the hallway, there was an opportunity cost, meaning I was there talking, but I didn't get the opportunity to go into the classroom. So for
Right.
those people who are looking at the management piece, look at the way you spend your time. Can you proactively say, I know we have to talk as a union. So can we do that on Friday mornings? And that's going to free up our time to be able to get into classrooms. It's
Yeah.
doing those kind of things that will help you go from reactive being proactive. That could be helpful.
I love that expression, opportunity cost. And I think so much of it is just about building routines, right? And trying to, I know that when I figured that out early in my career in administration, just figuring out to create routine predictability around when I'm going to visit classrooms. And it doesn't always have to be the same time every day, but it's trying to make sure that I have an hour each day or something like that. I think that's really valuable. I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk first to teachers, and then I want to finish up by talking about assistant principals, which is that sort of weird role that we have in schools. But I want to first talk to so listeners out there who are teachers, and they're maybe thinking about, I think my career path is leading to an assistant principalship, or that, I want to go down that road. So a lot of teachers aspire to get into administration, and they have thoughts that as they leave the classroom, they're going to be those instructional leaders. So from your perspective, is it enough for them to simply focus on what they're doing now, become an exceptional teacher? Is that enough? Or are there any other things that teachers should be thinking about as they you sort of have one eye on moving into administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think my thing is always to and maybe it's, I've been practicing, I've been a consistent practice. I've had a consistent meditation practice over the past 3 years. For me, it's about the here and now. What are you doing right now, presently, that's going to be deeply impactful? And what are some of those things that you're doing that you can bring into a leadership position? Like, it's always important to, if you want to go into leadership, yeah, keep your eye a little bit on, who are the people that you admire? What are the practices that maybe your principal is doing that you would never do? And what are the practices that the principal's doing that you would totally do? I mean, I would say that most of what you should be doing is just full on practicing, being as impactful with the kids as possible. But when you start to look at, like, if you really want to desire to go into leadership, know that it's not always every day. Like, I remember I had a couple of teachers say, it must be nice to be a principal. You can wake up every morning and know that you can control your whole day. And I'm like, I don't know where you think I'm working, but that's just not happening.
What?
So, yeah, like, so it's really about just understanding that when you get into school leadership, it is not always going to be about instructional leadership. There are going to be times that you've got to do things that you really don't like to do. I did not like every part of being a building principal, but I loved most parts. And it was 8 of the best years of my life that I was doing it. So to answer your question, yeah, from a teacher standpoint, focus on what you're doing right now, but also look at those practices that you think are going to be beneficial in the first place. And then maybe if you're interested in leadership, start taking on some leadership roles. Are you a PLC lead? Are you a department head? Are you on the school leadership team? And start practicing there, because I think that could be really helpful to get an understanding of what it's like to try to work with a group, because you can be very myopic too when you're in a classroom. You can think every classroom is like your classroom, and then you find out that working with a group is maybe a little bit different than you had first considered.
That is, I think, one of the biggest eye openers for me when I look back is moving from teacher to assistant principal and in the same school, and suddenly seeing behind the curtain and realizing that things happen very differently around the school, and you have to adjust because you have a mindset that everyone sort of thinks that the way you do. And I know that sounds a little arrogant, but I don't mean it from an arrogant perspective. We
No,
just
no,
sort
no,
of
no.
we have that tunnel vision, right? This is the way it's done, and you move into that role. So speaking of the assistant principal, which is, I find, myself fascinated with that role, because assistant principals are often in a funny position, right? sometimes they're the buffer between the principal and the faculty. Sometimes they're more instructionally knowledgeable because they have more recent classroom experience. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes their principal is not willing or able to be that instructional leader. So I'm wondering about advice for assistant principals now specifically. How can assistant principals, in essence, how can they be instructional leaders without inadvertently outshining their principal or sort of,
Mhm.
turning the spotlight, giving the appearance that they're not being loyal or they're trying to inadvertently undermine? Like how does an assistant principal find that balance between, if they are truly that instructionally relevant leader in this moment, how do they find that balance with where the principal is at?
Yeah, tread carefully.
Yeah, yeah,
So this
absolutely.
was probably one of my biggest areas of weakness because I was never an assistant principal and I
Mm,
never had an assistant principal. I went directly from teaching the high poverty school to being a principal in a rural suburban. And it wasn't until like 5 years ago when I was running a workshop on collaborative leadership, and it was all assistant principals, and it was through the University of Oklahoma. So it was a cohort I was going to be working with. I was talking about instructional leadership, and they did feedback every day that I was there. And their feedback was like, that's great stuff, but we can't do it. So the next day that they came in, we did an activity. And what I was surprised to find is that the biggest barrier to them practicing instructional leadership was, in fact, their school principal. And
mhm.
that kind of blew me away, I have to be honest. And I've learned a lot. I think that there are a few things. I think number one, it's you have to understand as an assistant principal, what are your true parameters? Because sometimes we have policies in our own head. Sometimes we think there's a rule that really isn't a rule. So figuring out what are your parameters, what grade levels or content areas are you really responsible for? And then how can you practice instructional leadership within those departments and grade levels?
Mhm.
It's I understand that you the outshining piece, the highest weed, has always been a problem we've had in education, because when
Mm.
you start to stand too high, there are lots of people that would like to chop you down, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So my first course of action is to always talk with principals, and meaning in my role that I have as a leadership coach and everything else, is to talk to school principals about leveraging their assistant principals and allowing them to practice instructional leadership, because there is a plethora of research that shows that assistant principals do a lot of discipline and patrol hallways, and they don't get the opportunity to do that.
Right.
When you can figure out your own parameters and you're working within these grade levels, then you need to do the best job you can do. And if other
Mhm.
people get upset with that, then that's, I'm sorry, this is going to be very blunt, but that's their problem. Because
Yeah.
if they're holding you back from being who you could truly be, that is a problem. And I think, Tom, you and I have probably experienced that, because I know I have.
Yeah.
When you realize that you're you're purposely not growing because you're worried it's going to hurt somebody else's feelings for the wrong reasons, which is about them, not you. That's a problem for me. I think
Yeah.
you need to not only, within those parameters that you've got, I think you practice and you go as deep as you possibly can with the practices that will make you a much better instructional leader, because
Mhm.
that concern is correct. If you don't practice instructional leadership as an assistant principal, then we're just cycling out these people that when they become principals, they're not
Right.
used to practicing it either. And that's going to be a problem. So, you know
Yeah, for
what?
sure.
Sometimes you just have to outshine people, and they're going to have to deal with it.
The best, and I'm sure you've encountered this as well, as the flip side. I was very fortunate in my assistant principalships to have principals who just said, you go with that.
Yeah.
That's your area of expertise, or that's, whether it was in instruction or it was grading or it was, and when they sort of hand the keys, figuratively hand the keys to the car over to you and say, and then there's that loyalty that develops. There's also that appreciation for giving you the space to grow. They are still the principal, and I think it's important that assistant principals understand that role, but still that's the best case scenario. And I've met so many principals over the last decade or so where they've just said, I want my assistant principal, this is their area of expertise, this is where I want them to thrive. And that's the best case scenario for any assistant principal who's in that type of situation. Peter, I could
Yeah.
talk to you about this stuff all day. Listeners, the book is Instructional Leadership by Peter DeWitt. You just listen. If you're a leader or you're an aspiring leader, you need to read this book. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. But Peter, we're going to finish up today with a few kind of fun questions and then maybe a little more serious question at the end. It's a segment called 3 Questions. I'm going to ask you 3 lighthearted questions so listeners can get to know you a little bit on a more personal level and just have some fun here as we wrap up today. So first question is kind of an either or choice question. Are you a breakfast guy or a dinner guy?
I am a dinner guy.
Okay.
I've been accused in the past of eating just to fill my stomach, not eating because I truly like. So over the years, my partner is a great cook. So I am a dinner guy because he's gotten me to experience food and enjoy it. So I guess I would say dinner guy.
Yeah, dinner seems to have more available, right? There seems to be more different kinds of flavors than there's only so many ways you can cook eggs, right? At some point, it's like it's enough already. All right, here's another one, a choice for you. Which would you choose? Always having to tell the truth, the stone cold truth, or always having to lie?
Oh, always having to tell the truth.
Yeah, even if it's ruthless.
Well, that's the thing, right? It's about making sure that you're not doing it in a ruthless way. I have no poker face whatsoever. I can't lie. I just can't. Yeah. I even start to get flustered when I even think about it. But no, I would much rather always tell the truth. It's just finding the way to do it in a polite way is what I practice.
Yeah, that would be hard. I don't know if that would be part of the mandate. It's like, hey, what do you think of my shoes? Oh, those are terrible. What do you think of my story? Nope, didn't work for me. I mean, I don't know which one would make you more enemies at some point when you're telling that stone cold truth to people. It'd be like, all right, I'm never asking Peter again.
Yeah, I think it's about making sure that you can say things like, maybe you don't like the shoes, but you can say they're perfect for your feet. Or just something.
There wasn't anything in my question about being gentle, Peter. It was just about that laser-like focus. Okay, last one. And I'm going to put an asterisk to this by saying you can't choose anyone in your family and you can't choose anyone in education. Okay. So that's the caveat. Okay. But the question is, who inspires you? Who outside of your family, outside of education, inspires you?
Jeez. Who inspired? Wow, you really just who outside of education and outside my family inspires me?
Celebrity, athlete, musician, anyone?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So this is that's really good. I'm glad you said that. So this is going to sound probably pretty corny, but so I am a big fan of a musician named Ludovico Einaudi, and I listen to his music all the time, especially when I'm writing or when I was flying somewhere, because sometimes I have anxiety, and his music always calmed me down. And what I like is that from the podcasts I've heard of him and the way he approaches music, he's not concerned about everybody else. He's concerned about just making the best music he's making and being creative. And I find that very inspiring, because, sometimes you get caught up in how are the words going to come out and what part of the group am I going to be in, and all that kind of stuff. And I find it very inspiring to sit there and say it's okay sometimes to just stand on your own and find your own creative self and do it this way. And I appreciate that.
Interesting. Yeah. Say the name again. Who's the musician?
So his name is Ludovico Einaudi. Yeah, he's pretty fantastic. So.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, we'll have to check that out as well. So I have one final question for you, Peter. It's a theme I run through the podcast. I've asked everyone I've interviewed the same question. And I'm trying to have a sort of overarching theme of success and happiness. And so the final question I have for you is, if a random person stopped you on the street and just asked you, what's your definition of success, how would you answer them?
My definition of success would be the connections that I have made and the family that I'm surrounded with. And it's become, COVID has not had a lot of positives. And unfortunately, because of the, so many deaths and everything, including within our own family. But one of the positives that have come out of COVID is the connection, maybe the reconnections we've made with home, and the understanding of what is truly, really special. So I would say the connections I've made with people, and then my family, that would be the greatest line of success for me in the future.
Yeah. Peter, let me first say I'm sorry to hear of your loss, and certainly I think we've all found out those connections and how important they are to us through almost deprivation, and not being able to see people. We've found the importance of those connections and a family and all of that. So really, I think that's a great way to wrap up today for us. Peter, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, listeners, you can follow Peter on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @PeterM.DeWitt. Pretty easy to find on Twitter. Same for the website, www.petermdewitt.com. And one more thing, listeners, and Peter, I want you to jump in here and tell listeners about, just very quickly, about the course you've created around the book Instructional Leadership, and most importantly, how listeners can access getting into that course and taking a deeper dive into this content.
Yeah, thanks. I created through a platform called Thinkific, and it is mostly asynchronous course, but I'm accepting cohorts. So we have cohort 1 right now. It's over 8 weeks, and it's mostly asynchronous, but we have, right now it's Mondays. We have optional Zoom meetings. We have discussion boards, all this stuff where we're working through each chapter. They've got basically a SMART goal, and things they have to do to be better in their practice. And then we discuss it through the discussion boards. We discuss it through our optional Zooms. And I will be offering it again, probably early summer, and they can find out more information about the whole thing if they just go to my website. There's something on there as well. So thank you for mentioning it.
Fantastic. Great. Peter, it was great to see you today, and I look forward to next time.
All right, Tom, thank you so much.
Great.